Welcome, everybody. It is a great pleasure to have here somebody who's been, for me, both inspiration, but I also like to say a friend, if Jim doesn't mind, ever since I sometimes say that, hey, Jean-Claude, good to see you. Welcome. I sometimes judge everybody by what they did after the hurricane and the storm, and people who ran into the burning building at 9/11 or ran out, or people came down to New Orleans and did. And when Jim was at the Gates Foundation, he helped us figure the whole thing out, and I think that's one reason the city survived. But he's been doing great on many things as Deputy Secretary of Education and also as one of the people leading My Brother's Keeper, which should be the signature initiative or part of a signature initiative package of the final 2.5 years of the president's term. But to welcome us here, we have John Galvin, who I've been picking his brain for the past half hour. He's probably bored of talking about it. But if you don't mind rewinding the tape and talking a little bit about what Intel is doing and welcoming us here, if you would, John.
Yeah, happy to. So, hello everyone, good afternoon. I'm John Galvin. I manage the education group at Intel, where we really focus on education as a vertical. And I'm delighted to be here today, certainly with Walter, also with Jim, but also with all of you to be able to talk about the transformation that's taking place in education today. This is really part of a series that we've been doing with the Aspen Institute on the innovation economy, and I think education is critical to that. And it's about taking a holistic approach to education. We just met Sheila Harity, who told us about her success and introducing technology into schools, but taking a very holistic approach within her high school. And we think that's the formula that everyone has to follow. It's about ensuring teachers are prepared. It's ensuring that you have the digital curriculum and assessment so that teachers really have the opportunity to provide a personalized learning experience. It's about certainly connectivity within the classrooms and ensuring that students can get to the information that they need and have a seamless experience. It's also about sustainability and ensuring that you have the budget to not do it 1 year, but to be able to sustain it over the next 10 years or the next 20 years. And it's about results and ensuring that we're doing the research and evaluating what works and what doesn't work, but overall putting the student at the center of that and ensuring that they have a different experience within the classroom than they had before.
But as a recovering biographer, I want you to say how you got to where you are, what you're actually doing.
Okay, thank you. So I've been at Intel for 19 years, and I don't have an education background. I've worked in sales and marketing my entire time there, and I was asked 3 years ago to look across the sales and marketing group and specifically across Intel and identify an area where transformation was called for. And we chose education not just because it was important to us, we worked in education for a long time, but because of the change that's taking place within education right now. And it felt like it was an opportunity for us to play a bigger role. And rather than us just be the horizontal supplier, which we've always been in supplying microprocessors into education, and to our partners, we now take a full solution approach. And so it starts with the teachers and ensuring we have professional development available for them. It's working across digital curriculum. We acquired a company last year in the US called Know, which gives us a digital platform where we can actually work with publishers and ensure the content is available. It's about software applications so that the students really see the device as an education device, not just a computer or a tablet. And it's about designing systems with our customers that will stand up to the rigors within a classroom, so they're a little bit more rugged. So this is the one area, this is the one vertical at Intel where we've really taken an end-to-an-end approach and are playing a bigger role than the role you would typically find us playing in any other industry.
So Jim, that opens up the first question, which is technology in the classroom. At first we thought it was going to change everything, and then suddenly it looked like it wasn't going to change anything, and now I think we're getting back to where it's a proper role. But tell us where you think the proper role is.
So right into the first year of our time in office, we put out a new version. We're required by Congress to put out something called the National Education Technology Plan. And Karen Cater, who was the head of the Office of Education Technology, came in actually to help finish that up and did a fantastic job. But I think the most important thing that we did with that was to name it properly, which is learning powered by technology. One of the things that has often caught us, put us in the wrong footing, I think, when it comes to education technology is the technology leads. People think that technology is going to come in and be a savior, it's going to be the silver bullet, it's going to change everything. And we've seen that fail a couple of times already. In my short time in and around the education space, has happened at least once every decade. The thing that is actually different this time is some of the technological capability, but the most important thing is that what it is, the technological capabilities are actually being framed in a way that what you heard John say is really important. That people are really starting to think about how do we not shove our technology products in as is and make them, make teachers and students use them, but how do we actually craft solutions that meet the needs that they actually have in the classroom? So let me just say one thing about the technology side and what's changing about that, and then what I think the implications are inside the classroom. So ubiquitous broadband, specifically wireless, low cost, very powerful devices, digital content, like almost anywhere, any kind of content that you want, highly interactive, that puts off a data stream that allows you to figure out exactly what's happening, not only in the outcomes of a student, but with the process of learning. All of those things happening in a context where some of the largest groups of folks going online and using applications are now women in the ages of between 30 and 50. And you've got a very different kind of dynamic around technology in general than you've ever had before, which creates a context where a teacher, even 10 years ago, who was told to integrate technology into her classroom, who odds are probably had 4 computers in the back of the room, one of which was likely to be broken, and a day or two to have a tech rep come to help fix it, made a very rational decision not to jump all in. Like, it was just not practical. All the things I just talked about make it much more practical, not only to have a student population fully immersed, but a teacher know that what's there is going to be there for every student, it can be reliable for every student, and can save time and resources and make them more effective.
And do you think having a particular tablet for every student is a key to this?
So I think it's all about, you can take it from one end of the spectrum to the other. The closer you get to being able to have a device for every student, obviously the same for the teacher, access in school and access out of school, the more capabilities you're going to be able to bring to bear, the less you have to worry about equity issues, and frankly, the more empowered the students are going to be. Not forget about the teacher for a second, the students are going to be. So I think that getting there has got to be something that we keep directly in mind. And frankly, when you think about the sustainability piece that John talked about, one way or the other, we have to get to the place where we can shift costs from somewhere to the new solutions that we want to have. If you don't have it one-to-one, it means usually you're going to have to add on. But once you go one-to-one, then you can start thinking about things that you're spending resources on that you can actually build into the cost of the device, the cost of the software.
That was a nice euphemism about cost and all, but
Yeah.
do you think this actually reduces the cost of teaching in classrooms?
I don't know if it reduces it, but what we're seeing is people being able to, basically, once they get past the initial investment that it takes to get started, which is a lot, that they can actually, with the same basic operating dollars, keep it going.
You know, we were talking, John and I and others, about Amplify, which John or Intel has provided some of the platforms for, and they have many things going. They have games on a different platform. Mark Kimsey and I and some others have been working with Khan Academy, and I was there yesterday, doing a whole day yesterday of Khan Academy things, and that's sort of his own new shop. To what extent do core standards or some way of making sure that all these things can fit in, as opposed to just being random people all over the place saying, I've now got a new interactive curriculum?
Sure. So anybody who's been around the technology sector, anybody who's been around innovation knows that standards are what allow an ecosystem to evolve very quickly. So you can get interoperability, you can get things that work together, you can have one developer working on one part of a solution, another working on another part, and they all ultimately come together in a way that makes sense to the folks that have to use it in the end. Similarly, before I left the Gates Foundation, I will say the last thing I did was work on what was called the Next Generation Learning Strategy. It's not the strategy we wound up implementing, but one of the big parts of it was, what are the policies that would most unlock innovation? And it turns out when you do the analysis, like having common goals and then letting everyone chase those common goals, some would call them common standards, is one of the biggest levers for innovation that you can have in a sector. And so the common standards that allow a developer to develop and know that it's going to cut across not just thousands or tens of thousands, but hundreds of thousands, if not millions of students, thousands of schools, that when people develop the professional development and our training resources go with that, they're going to be able to amortize that across thousands of people. That's a big deal, let alone the fact that the world kind of follows us on lots of things, and the opportunity that means for the rest of the world too.
When I was out there yesterday, Sal Khan has moved to a new building.
Okay.
You know, so he has a bigger space. But on the ground floor, he's creating a school that opens today. It's for 40 people, because he said schools just don't know how to integrate this stuff in. I've got to do it myself to figure it out. We went downstairs and watched them do it. Describe to me, if you got that chance to open a school, what it would look like, what you would, you know, what would be a classroom that would be really good and perfect?
So I got to set some parameters. So let's start at the secondary level. And I think that Sheila, in describing what she did at Worcester, described a lot of what I think is really important. So many folks who've been around this stuff long enough know the classic phrases like rigor, relevance, and relationships and all that good stuff. So the question is, how in your classroom do you create a community that has common support and aspirations with each other, but that knows that what they're going to learn in that classroom is relevant to what they want to try and do? So on the technology side, it's obviously got wireless access, really well-designed devices that allow them to take notes, have all of their books, have all the interactive content, access the web, all accessible.
Take notes, you used a little stylus.
So
so you like Surface or something like that?
So I like the fact that there's a natural instinct to be able to take notes in a way that's less intrusive than when everyone's doing like this right now. That comes with a stylus. You know, I can't endorse one particular thing, but I do think that having the full array of actual keyboard, an actual stylus, and the full range of opportunities to input in the way that is easiest for you at that moment in time is a pretty important thing to have. Like, ultimately what you want is to have an interface that feels seamless to the student, whatever that is. And so if you can get it to the point where keyboarding is really, really natural, great. 25 kids, still just a little bit intrusive on the classroom. But we're seeing that change quickly as well. So, but that's just the technology piece. The teacher, call it the facilitator, then is able to help the students against this common set of goals that they're all very clear and transparent about, that they want to actually learn by, that they're set individual goals but have collective goals, that they've established how those goals connect to what they want to be at the secondary level in terms of what kind of careers they're actually interested in, what other kind of interests that they have, what other kinds of mentors and experts they can access, and that there's a natural relevance that is able to be integrated into the daily exercises of the students because they have that connection either to an employer or an advanced, someone doing advanced work in a laboratory or whatever the case might be. The other thing that actually is ideal is that the notion is that there's constant connectivity between the students and the students with the adult or the facilitator in the classroom, the teacher, and with folks on the outside who can help them. And
what do you mean? You mean real time? The teacher gets to know what's being written on the tablet?
Well, I mean, in real time, sometimes that's the case. Definitely, you see it more and more people coming up with solutions that allow the teacher to throw the students' work right up on the board, right there in front of everyone, to be able to take polls of the classroom all at once, and everyone answers the same questions to check for understanding. But also to be able to, I mean, you can kind of notice when a student seems like they're checked out and be able to take a quick glance to say what's happening on the screen. Those kinds of tools for check-ins and things like that also really, really important. Also, ways in the new world that you would check in on a student kind of the way you would walking around, putting your hand on their shoulder in our old classrooms. Not that you won't do that, but you have many more ways to do it.
We had a drinking game in Aspen a couple of years ago, which is when anybody said flipped classroom,
Yep.
the staff got to take a shot, and they were drunk by the end of the week, every day.
Yeah.
And now I haven't heard the word flipped classroom in the past year or so. Is that a passing fad?
I don't think it's a passing fad. I think that what people are doing is getting more nuanced in what their understanding of a flipped classroom is. And so you'll hear blended classrooms, you'll hear flipped classrooms, you'll hear all these different euphemisms being used for the notion that technology is finding its way in. All the tools that technology enables are finding their way in. But what people are now saying is, okay, but the function of teaching and learning is still what I'm about. So whether I'm having the kids do the lectures at home, I still, when I'm with them, I'm trying to figure out how do I engage them in a way that's going to help them master whatever they heard that night and take it to the next level of deeper understanding while they're with me the next day. Or how do I take the things that they didn't get the night before and make sure that they master them before I get them out of the way, before we move on. All of those things, we'll land on some names in a little while. But I think that we're still got several iterations to go through. The thing that I'm happy about is that people are wrestling with the right stuff now. They're wrestling with the notion of, okay, I really am about achieving a different learning outcome. I am about achieving a different level of engagement by letting students move at their own pace and chase some things that they're really, really interested in and go deeper on things. I am interested in figuring out how I help students access each other to help each other with the work, and how they access other people besides me as a classroom teacher to get really good insights and work done. And they're trying to figure out, how do I allow students, when you talk about empowered learning, or personalized learning, people always think about, well, I can move at my own pace and all that good stuff. Well, it means that, but it also means that I can really chase something I'm interested in. Like, I don't want to stop here. I want to go 3 levels down on this particular topic. And teachers are trying to figure out how they enable that. And it's been hard without the tools to do that. It just takes too much time and effort. I talk about this all the time, and I know I give long answers, I'm sorry. But when you ask a teacher to walk into a classroom about this big and to know exactly what each student knows, exactly what they're interested in, and match it with the perfect instructional approach and the perfect content with colored markers and a whiteboard, like some teachers are able to do that, and it is absolutely incredible. But teachers are still the second largest profession in the country, right? Retailers are the first, if you're wondering. So we've got to be able to get to that many people, even if you said you could do it with less, which I'm not one of those people, that many people, and allow them to do great work. Not good work, great work. And that's not going to happen without a very different set of tools and a very different set of capabilities than what we've got today, especially when you start talking about closing gaps.
Sheila, you've gotten a couple of shout-outs already. Sheila Hardy, who is Principal of the Year, which is but Worcester Tech, right? So maybe you can open up the question period, if you would, and talk, if you want to, about how you've been applying tech. Because you took a school that was almost going to be shut down, if I remember correct. And
Yes, it was the lowest performing high school in our city, and one of the,
or just
Pull the mic.
pull the
Speak a
mic
little.
towards you, yeah.
And you don't get a choice.
I'll use
Talk
my
about it.
principal
Yeah, talk about
voice.
it.
I can do that. So at Worcester Tech, unfortunately, at one time, it was the lowest performing high school in our city and one of the poorest performing vocational schools in our state. And it was actually going to be closed. And our business and higher ed partners rallied around career and technical education and built a brand new $90 million facility. And I was asked to be the brand new principal to open up the facility. And I'm really proud to say that our community has done it right. We have a 400,000 square foot facility that's wireless. It is equipped with all the latest and greatest technologies. We have 24 different technical programs. The building's wireless. We have 2,000 computers. Every single teacher has a laptop. And when you're thinking about academic, so our students, in 1 week they have their academics, the opposite week they have their technical program, they flip back and forth. Way too often students are walking through comprehensive high schools not sure why they're learning what they're learning. And at Worcester Tech, the authentic learning experience is there, incorporated in the technology. In, for instance, mathematics classes, we have Sentio products. So as the teacher is teaching various lessons and standards, the Sentio products go out, real-time assessments to see if the students are grasping the materials or not. And it really creates an environment of trust that students can help one another and support one another. In the technical programs, we have CNC machines, we have CAD/CAM embedded obviously into our computers, we have precision manufacturing. In the Allied Health program, our students are graduating with CNA, home health aid, CPR, first aid certification, EMT certification, and they use the SINMAN product where they're working on a computer patient, diagnosing and so forth. And it's those types of technologies that are incorporated in our school that really have made our school so successful. In addition, we do not have one teacher that oversees our technology. And you just heard every single classroom has a smart board, numerous iPads and so forth. We actually created a ticketing system. And we deploy our telecommunication students in the afternoon to do the entire troubleshooting for every single computer in our school. So it's real work, authentic work, and they're also responsible for our portal as well, and our web design and so forth. And so many people said, you know, how can you possibly give students that type of responsibility? They thrive in that kind of atmosphere because it's so engaging and so real that they're so proud to come to school. And I'm really proud to say we're the second largest city in New England, and we have a 95% graduation rate. And certainly technology and bringing learning alive. Thank you.
Let me open it up for anybody else who wants to questions, please.
Can
Go
I,
ahead. Oh, go ahead.
one highlight, so Sheila, how did you pay for all that technology?
We opened a 501c3 because we're a city school, we didn't have the money. So we have 350 business and higher ed partners aligned to all 24 technical programs so that our students are graduating both career and college ready with industry recognized credentials as well as college credits. For instance, our telecommunications students are graduating with an associate's degree from Northeastern University, 18 college credits free of charge. But we didn't have the money, so we worked on business partners, created the entrustment, and partnered with various companies. For instance, Konica Minolta. We have the print source. Our graphic students are the print source for the entire city, for Worcester Public Schools, the police, the fire, and so forth, City Hall. And when we partnered with Konica Minolta, they gave us an incredible amount of equipment at a significant lower cost, but they can bring any of their clients to our school. If you can bring a client in and have the high school students demonstrate their product and how it works, and in the evenings they can come and use our facility for a training center as well. Any way to think creatively out of the box. We want to make sure that our high school is not closed at 1:45 in the afternoon. It's actually open every single night till 10 o'clock at night.
And then I wanted to highlight,
3D printers, absolutely. Yes, we do banners, and absolutely.
and I just wanted to highlight it, not only because of the terrific partnerships, but because those are fantastic, but because we can't keep doing it that way, right? The reason the president launched Connect Ed is that we need to invest as a country in the infrastructure to connect all our schools and make sure they all have broadband. We need to find ways to make it much easier for every district to actually buy the devices at cost that they need. There was a report that came out yesterday that looked at the differential in price that Vermont paid versus Los Angeles paid for their, I won't call out the device name, their pad that they used. And there was a 43% difference in the pricing for the same number of units. So we just are not doing the things that we know we need to do to make it really easily accessible to many more schools and many more districts to make the full conversion. And one of the big takeaways is that if you can't get to critical mass, like it's hard to switch a school over because you really have a great online math program. Like make all the investment in hardware, make all the investment in professional development. You really have to be able to go all the way. And if you can't go all the way, then it gets much more difficult to get to any reasonable investment. All right, other questions?
I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. I had to invite myself to this event, so thank you for letting me come. And just as background, John Dewey was my godfather and my mother's intellectual godfather. She went to Columbia and typed all his books. So I come to this from a very early age on. The first question I had, which perhaps you answered, was what a fabulous idea. How do you scale it? But since scaling it isn't so easy, what are the other design alternatives that you have to be able to bring this kind of experience. The other thing I'm going to ask is how do we change the incentive system so that people in the early, who are teaching in the early grades get really well paid, because that's such an important thing, rather than sort of being the lowest on the, I mean, I think incentives are a very important thing. And I don't hear anybody talking about it. I went to a meeting at the Chamber of Commerce, and the head of the chamber was talking about the importance of early childhood education. And I said, what do you do about paying them well? We pay people that teach at colleges very well, but they may only teach 15 people.
Go ahead,
So,
Jim.
anyway,
So I get in trouble all the time for talking too much about incentives. So, but I think that we have to pay. Sorry about that. We have to pay really close attention to incentives all the way around. And I'm going to go off on this for a second, and then I'll come back to our core technology conversation. You know, people say, well, what's the role of the federal government in all this? And I always say it's to create the context for good people to do great work. And that means a lot of things, but in particular what it means is making sure that whatever incentives and resources we're putting out there direct people point people in the right direction. What that specifically is a lot of the work we did, whether it was the college and career ready standards or the data systems to tell you whether you're making progress or not, or making learning at the center of the question of whether or not we call ourselves being effective as schools or as educators, or dealing with the worst performing schools, that all the incentives are about helping children learn, helping students grow, and making sure that when you're done with them, they actually have a real option at the end. What we also know is that at the individual level and at the teacher level, what we are trying to do is create an incentive system that draws people into education who are highly talented, highly capable, and highly committed. And what you talk about in the pay side is one part of it. The other part of it is what is the context we're setting up with them, and what, again, back to what kind of tools and support do we give them to have a higher probability of success. Who wants to come in and fail every day, and more importantly, who wants to come in every day and not only feel like you're struggling and not doing what you entered the profession to do, but be told you're not doing what you came into the profession to do. Now, this isn't about preschool pay, but what it is about is equipping professionals with the tools they need to be successful. And remember what I said earlier about what we ask teachers to do every day. The question for all of us needs to be, how do we keep putting more and more tools and resources at disposal of educators, be they school leaders or school teachers or the people who support them, that help them fulfill this mission that we have of giving every kid a real shot. And we're far away from creating that kind of context right now. The technology piece is just one small part of it.
Charlie?
So I know you've worked with the MacArthur Foundation, and we just concluded a task force on learning and the internet, where we looked at learner at the center and looked at learning beyond just the classroom, that you have libraries, museums, home, online, various places that a person can learn through their own individualized or collaborative learning. And I guess my question is, how does the education department, which looks at education in schools, think about learning today outside the classroom, and what are you doing towards that?
So, interestingly, we actually think about it a lot inside and outside of schools. So all of our policy obviously is directed at what happens inside school buildings. But when you look at programs like the 21st Century Community Learning Centers and things like that, clearly we have a recognition, and it shows up in both the Secretary's words, our policies, and our programs, that it is about actually extending learning time, extending into the spaces outside of the school building. And that, in fact, the research has become more and more clear that a lot of what happens inside school buildings seems to not be, in some cases, as big a differentiator as the kind of support you can provide outside to reinforce what happens inside the school building. Both are important, but we're more and more recognizing the importance of the outside. So one of the things that we think that the technology actually helps is, it is a lower cost mechanism to extend that learning time and make sure that there's really good alignment between what's happening inside the school building and the kinds of learning experiences and opportunities young people have outside of the building. Where we need to get much better at is being able to understand and validate those learning experiences against the things that we have hardcore expectations about. And we suck at it. that's a technical term. But we just don't. We're not really creative about our assessments. We're not really creative about how we validate learning in different contexts.
So the badging, can I just?
Sure.
The badging movement, or, as more and more people are moving to badging, what's your feeling about that?
So I think that the badging thing has real promise. Here's the deal. In all of this, whether you're talking about early learning, you're talking about K-12 or workforce preparation, you're talking about competencies, knowledge and skills that people need to have. So the question is, not only how do you get people those competencies, and how do you measure and that they have those competencies and their progress to those competencies, but for our systems to work, how do you validate that they have those competencies? Now, the badges are meant to be a signal that you have that we have validated your competency. And so what I will say is that is a critically important part for us to do. I'm not clear that any of the badging systems that I've seen have filled the void, though, right? So what employer is relying on, feels comfortable enough with a badge that they are willing to rely on any of our badging systems right now that somebody actually has a competence? And what college is willing to say, this assemblage of badges gives me confidence that we ought to let them into the school and they're going to be able to perform well? And until we can cross that Rubicon, the badges are going to be niceties.
The federal government's role in that, after sort of the singeing that happened on course standards, does that give you a pause to say we have a role?
So here's what I think. I think that our role in developing curriculum for that, or developing the actual assessments to do that, we should not be in that game. Should we be in the game of supporting the research that leads to being able to build those systems? Should we be investing in R&D, specifically developing new ways to do that work? Should we be doing the work to help create the context where people can have the space and flexibility to try out new forms of a flexible assessment that lets you determine whether they have those competencies? Should we be adjusting our policy set at the higher education level in particular to allow people to draw down aid based on those kinds of systems? Yes, we should be doing all of those things, which again, back to the point of incentives, create the incentive systems for people to both create the tools and resources that they need to make these competency-based systems work, but also so that our systems work right? Right now, one of our biggest, let me put it this way, we talk oftentimes about the cost of our education system, and one of the things I say often is we have never ever figured out the cost of our education system if we actually got it right the first time, every time. Right? I mean, how much of our resources, and JC knows this, do we spend redoing the things that we didn't do well? Well, imagine if, at least if we were going to redo things, we only redid the things that we needed to do over. And so it's very seldom that a student goes through a class and doesn't learn anything. But right now, our remedy is if they need to make it up, they got to do everything again. It's very seldom that when somebody enters college not quite ready, they are not quite ready across the board. But we make them go through everything. There are exceptions, but that's generally how it works. If we can create systems that allow us to be much more precise about what we cause people to spend their time on and their resources on, we can make the system not only more effective, but much more efficient, and direct more resources to the things that people most need their help on.
Yep. David, from the way back, why don't you get a seat?
Well,
David
I'm gonna
Sutton,
leave
since he has
early,
no
so
tent card.
I didn't want to. Quick question. I want to know what lessons, if any, should we learn from what happened in LA with LA Unified and iPad, and just in light of all the challenges that you talked about?
Yeah. I think the most important lesson from LA is that as we try to make change, things are going to go wrong. And what I love about what happened in LA is something went wrong, they backed up from it, said we need to rethink our approach, and then they went back at it again. That, for us to make progress, is essential. Are there questions about how do we make sure that people are much more informed about the effective practices that are working in lots of other places? What kinds of due diligence questions should all these districts that are out there trying to make these purchases on their own, what kind of questions should they be asking to make sure that they've asked all the right questions? That's a knowable set of things, And I'm not sure we're doing a great job of making sure they all have that set of questions. I'm not sure they're doing all they should to try and access it. But the most important lesson from LA is fall down, get back up, try again.
But what do you think they did wrong? Where did they fail?
To be honest, I don't know enough to know.
Or David, you have a thought?
I don't know enough. I don't know enough to know that I would say that they did anything wrong. John, do you want to answer that?
Well, I'd like to give my point of view on what I think they did right.
There you go.
In addition to Jim's point, LA Unified took a very comprehensive approach. It wasn't just about bringing computing devices into their classrooms, whether they're tablets or notebooks or other devices, but it was about professional development for the teachers. It was ensuring that they had all of the digital curriculum that they needed so that the devices could be used every day in classrooms across multiple subjects, and ensuring that they had service and support so that they could sustain those devices within the classrooms over a very long period of time. And so, again, to Jim's point, a couple of things went wrong in that process. I think they had a big light that was shined on them as a result of that, and I actually think it slowed down some of the adoption for a little while. But now I think they're back on the right track, and they're taking a very holistic approach to how they bring technology into their school district.
Jean-Claude, tell us about Upshot, right? Or,
Upspring.
Upspring, sorry.
It's all about revolution.
I always try to keep up with your
Yes.
career, so.
It's hard to keep up. Jim, I was going to ask you to dream about assessment and how technology can actually change assessment, but you've touched on that, excuse me. Dream a bit about, and talk about a bit about how you see technology changing teacher development and you evolutionizing that.
Sure. I mean, so all the things that we have spent a lot of time talking about and thinking about personalization and how it applies to students and how you build community, all of that applies to the teacher as well. It should. I don't think we spend as much time thinking about it and talking about that. I think for a couple of reasons. The first one is that I think that more and more we're getting comfortable, we can start to identify in ways that are validated rigorously, like what are the things that we actually need to be helping teachers with, and that we have a set of rubrics to measure those things against that we can then give them feedback on and then help them with tools. So the reason I start with that is because you can't personalize, you still have to have something that you're shooting towards. And so being able to say, here's where you're strong and here's where you're not is the first part in that process. The second thing is that is even more likely to be very highly variant among teachers than it is even among students, especially over time. And so back to this point about not making people do things that they don't need to spend time on, teachers don't have time. Like when you say, what is the real constrained resource in schools? It is teacher time. And so being able to say, you know, you do 8 out of 15 things really, really well, but these 7 are the ones that you ought to be spending some time on. And by the way, these 2 are the ones that are probably most predictive of whether your class is going to be successful this year, given who's in your class. That's a capability that we are beginning to have. And then being able to connect them then to the best resources to help them with that. Not only like online training programs and things like that, but communities of other people who either are really successful at what they're not good at, or who are struggling through the same thing. And that opportunity to, you know, people talk about in traditional school, opening the classroom door, and this is that on steroids, right? And oftentimes when we have these conversations, people often imagine the districts that we're in, right? Like DC and Chicago. But imagine rural America, right? You are the only science teacher, period. And now I find out I have a gap. There's content I just don't know the way I need to. Who do I talk to about that in my town? Well, now I've got a world to talk to, and I've got a world of resources to access, and that is going to change a lot.
Maria, is your light on for a reason, or?
Yeah.
And maybe Sheila, if you could turn yours off, we have a.
I want to go back to the LA question, or more generally, the one-to-one initiative question. My name is Maria Wortham with the International Association for K-12 Online Learning. I think the question schools should be asking is not how do we get a one-to-one initiative, but and not how are we going to use the computers or the iPads once we get them, but how can technology fundamentally change what teaching and learning look like in our school or our district, and then let the questions about technology flow from that. How can technology allow us to do something that we simply couldn't do without it. How can we personalize learning and provide competency-based pathways for students and multiply, rather than not replace the teacher, actually multiply the effect of a teacher? Speaking of LA, I was visiting a charter school in LA last Thursday called Da Vinci Communications. They have a project-based learning model. And one thing they told me is that one of the challenges of the project-based learning model is that it becomes really hard for teachers to have a rigorous project-based model, but also rigorous core learning in math and science and ELA. And so what they're doing is they're bringing in online classes in those core subjects. They're taking their math online with a licensed teacher facilitator on the side. And then the teachers are really able to deeply engage with these cross-curricular projects. They're learning about conflict minerals. In chemistry, they're looking at the makeup of conflict minerals. In social studies, they're looking at the geopolitical impact of the slave labor conditions and the wars that occur on these minerals. In math, they're looking at data and statistics. They're getting really deep and they're really engaged. And I talked to one of the kids about, what's it like to take math online and have one kid who's doing geometry, one kid that's doing algebra 2, and one kid that's doing trig, all working on the same project. She said, number one, we're not being tracked anymore. We're able to learn at our level, but we're able to engage in the same rigor with our project. And number two, I can't advance in my math class until I've proved that I've gotten it. In my old math class, we were all batched, we were all moved along at the same pace, and if you didn't get it, too bad. Now I have to singularly demonstrate my competency before I can move on. So this is an example of a school that's completely re-examined what teaching and learning can look like, and they've leveraged technology in that way. They started with that question, not how can we get a computer in the hands of all
Well,
of
we'd
our
like Jim,
students.
because that's a pretty radical approach. I mean, do you see much of that now?
Yeah, so much is all relative, right? And so I talked about the spectrum earlier, right? So there's folks who use the technology just for access, right? And this one is the easy one for me. Like, there's no excuse not to have every AP available in every school in the country or any foreign language that they want. Like, nowadays, there's just not an excuse for some of these inequities that exist, even if it is the online opportunity. We know that's how to happen. Better information, so the formative assessment and the feedback loops and all that good stuff, that's the next level that people tend to get into, where you heard. They're able to do the check-in, able to do the formative assessment, and get the immediate feedback and figure out what to do next. The very different interactive content, very different learning experience. The collaboration, very different experience. Actual creation, a very different experience. And so what you're seeing is some who actually take off and bite and take the entire layered cake and get every single layer. And then there are others who you say, oh, we're going to start with pieces of this and evolve. I'm not seeing a lot of schools that have gone as far as what she just described with Da Vinci, right? The really going to competency base, really allowing students to have tremendous flexibility about how they're going to progress, even mixing up age grade levels and things like that. But you are seeing more and more people moving in that direction. I think that the fact that we have diversity is really important right now. There's really important debate going on about the pedagogical reasons to have students doing work together that are actually studying the same things. There's tension with that, obviously, with self-paced. And so people are trying to figure out where those lines are, where those boundaries are. I don't necessarily even think there's one great answer. I think it's really important that people are chasing them in different directions so we can figure it out.
Yes, Alan.
Alan Merton, former president of George Mason University. One topic we haven't had so far is this thing called change. Everything, the subtopic is change, but everyone there's someone else to change. It's often said that the only thing that's more difficult to get to change in the medical profession is a teacher. And so the question is, who are the barriers to getting something done, and how do we deal with them?
There's a bunch of them. So I'll point the fingers at ourselves, right? So in higher education, somewhere between our policies around how we award aid, the constraints we have around competency-based direct assessment and things like that, all for great reason, but it makes it hard to innovate and change, to do things very differently. Probably More scary to many of you guys than us are the accreditors and their willingness to actually take risks with folks who want to try some different things. I see a knowing smile. So the regulatory folks, we have to create the space and opportunity for people to do things that are different. That's kind of a precondition for change in a lot of different ways. You'll have mavericks that will run ahead, but if we want scale change, we're going to have to get the regulatory framework right to create the flexibility. The second thing is that people always go straight to the educators having been willing to change. I actually put a lot of the onus on people who provide tools and resources to educators. And what I mean by that is, like, product design in the education space for the last, I would call it 3 to 4 decades, has, again, I'll refer to my technical term, it's sucked. It's just been really bad. There have been a few notable different examples, but for the most part, whether you were talking about even the, like, people talk about the really creative learning games and stuff, like I cut on educational game, my son can pick it out in about 15 seconds. Like, it's just like, this is nothing like any other game.
Nobody's getting shot.
But not only just not getting shot, but even the level of graphics, the level of intuitiveness, the ability to just jump in. And what we've now that we have seen some that are actually really well designed, we know that those two things are not distinct. So I put a lot of onus on people who both are supposed to be supporting educators through training and development, meaning teacher preparatory institutions, because they're supposed to be showing people what the future looks like, not just what the past looks like, as well as people who provide tools and resources for those folks. And then I go to, obviously, the states and the systems that have to encourage this work. But I'll come back to the federal infrastructure. We have to be willing to invest in both the R&D and the infrastructure, I think, at a federal level to allow this to happen at pace. And if we don't create the basic context for people to be able to make the change, it's going to be way too slow. The last thing I'll say on this front is, obviously, the frontline educator has to be willing to change. Parents have to give them some room to try some things that are different. But in the end, we've got to get the institutions, including unions that support educators, to consistently acknowledge that the future is coming, that the concerns about how this plays out in terms of numbers of teaching professionals and things like that, those questions will be answered as we get to better solutions. I actually have very little concern that we're going to satiate our desire to have kids learn, right? And so whatever we figure out we can do with technology, we're going to want more than that, and that's going to come through educators.
You've danced it around a little bit, but how do you think that the unions have generally been resistant
to the technology stuff? Not particularly. I think that there's 3 things that wind up being an issue. One is when there's always a question about, well, where's the money going to come from, and is it actually going to come out of teachers' pockets or keep me from hiring another teacher? That's always a question. Second question is always, am I going to get the support, are my teachers going to get the support they need to make the transition and learn how to use the technology? That's actually the second question that comes up. Then the third question that comes up is, are teachers going to be displaced by this technology? And for the most part, there are some noted examples, but for the most part, that has not been the center of the conversation.
Well, let me ask you about the fourth question I sometimes hear, which is, this is sort of a real-time assessment of the teachers, almost every day, what kid learned what in what classroom, and that could be either great or problematic.
So in my take on it is that for the most part, I'll separate this from unions and teachers. For the most part, the vast majority of teachers I encounter are super excited about their ability to actually have much more information about where their students are, what they got, and what they didn't get. They also are comfortable with the fact, depending on how it's used, that their principal or the grade level team will also have transparency in terms of the data about what's happened with their student. In fact, the places where I've seen this stuff have the most powerful impacts is when they take that data and they do sit down with their teams. Catherine's got her pioneers here working in DC, and they actively cultivate those cultures in schools where teachers are sharing that data with each other to help each other get better. So I see that kind of peer accountability actually working really well. I think no one has gotten to the point where we're like sucking the data out of these systems and using it for the broad accountability system. I haven't seen that yet. I think if that starts to happen, there'll be another chorus of concern. But I don't think that that's where it's going.
Did you want to add to that, Catherine?
I guess just a follow-on question just a follow-on question that if you play that out where we're going with personalized learning, and what we're seeing in DC is incredibly exciting about what is possible with school redesign around personalized learning. It does force all of us to rethink and maybe undo some of what's just been done around teacher evaluation.
Yep.
One teacher, 20 kids, the impact of that teacher on student learning. So how are you all thinking through revisiting some of what you've just finished around teacher evaluation, given what's coming, which we all believe is going to be really good for kids?
Yeah. So one, after I talk about this, I wish you would just spend 30 seconds on what was happening here in DC that you talked about.
Okay, but I'm going to have the person who's actually running the program, who's also at the table, do it.
That's fantastic. Okay, so here's my take on it. The evaluation systems that we have, because they're going to probably govern the vast majority of the system for a long time, critically important, they will be very important for the long term. The most important thing, though, that has happened around, that we've tried to do around evaluation is to say the most important thing, significant, and perhaps the most important thing, is whether or not the kid is learning, whether they're making progress or not. So I am confident that the evaluation systems that we have today are going to look very different for a whole number of reasons in 10 years than they look right now. But the thing that I hope will be maintained, no matter what those systems look like, is that it is tied to whether or not students learn under your care. And that needs to change form as students are progressing on their own, and we need to get more sophisticated, not only about like what's happening with individual students versus group and all that good stuff, but suppose you're really good at the immediate, but you are terrible at setting up what's going to come next. We ought to be able over time to start to figure out who are those teachers? Who are the teachers that make every year after they have a student better? And who are those teachers that are just really good at getting them to master what's in the classroom today, and then it's going to kind of be gone? Those are the kinds of questions we need to be asking ourselves, as well as the dynamics of how the structures of classrooms and systems are going to change. But at the center of it all is who has actually got the skills and the knowledge to move kids forward.
Steve, you got a shout out. You got to.
All right, I'll try to do a 60-second elevator pitch here. Time me. So City Bridge is running something called Breakthrough Schools DC, which is a school design and redesign process for which teams of educators serving public school students, either in district schools or in charter schools, are eligible. It's a pretty comprehensive design process that culminates in a competitive submission of proposals. We're going to have 3 rounds of proposals that are reviewed and funded. We've been through 1 round already where we selected 6 teams of educators, and we're about to have proposals submitted for our 2nd round. To that end, I've got a question for Jim and others, which is that our Breakthrough Schools DC design process is really centered around personalized learning. And the question I ask folks in the know all the time is there a system or a model of personalized learning of which you are aware that has been around long enough and has served enough students that there is evidence that it works well? And the reason I ask that is because there's this proliferation of what's called personalized learning models that tend to be really new, and I don't see that there's the data set yet to show if they work or they don't
And
work.
is this like the School of One model that they started many years ago in New York, or is that?
That's my question. I mean,
Okay.
I would love to hear if other people have something to say.
How are you defining personalized learning? I mean,
That's the
can mean
question.
a lot of different things to a lot of different people.
So it really wasn't a rhetorical question. As I'm curious to hear what people think, but one of our winners in our first round was a system of Montessori schools, which to me is actually an older, been around 100 years, it's at scale. That's a personalized learning model where instruction is differentiated per child, where, as one of my colleagues said earlier today, who's a Montessori graduate, there's a station rotation piece to that. I mean, are there other models like that that have been around a long time that those of us in this space can take a look at as we're trying to plow ahead with this?
Well, I mean, if you're in DC, you probably have been to some of these schools. And the one I was thinking about, Maria, when you mentioned project-based learning is, expeditionary learning has been around a long time and has their root in a lot of ways with both Montessori and even to a certain extent Waldorf, which are sort of these age-old models. But they would probably define personalized learning very differently than a lot of the more technology-focused models. So again, I think it's really, what you're looking for and maybe piecing together little bits of what has shown so much promise. I mean, they have been at it for quite a while. But their data set isn't super robust even after all these years. So that's one of the bigger problems, which I was going to ask later about the
Mark?
research.
Well, no, that's not on the same subject.
No,
but when you-
okay. Were you on the subject, Catherine? Did you want to say something? No.
You go ahead first.
Well, I'm going to take it off, so if, I'm going to ask Walter a question about it.
Oh, well then, Catherine?
So I was just going to take it back. I think possible, Walter, you had thrown me that question for a slightly different program we're doing, which is teacher training around how to use technology and blended learning within schools. That program is actually feeding directly into this whole school redesign process. But what we really found is that it took a lot of intentionality and time to get teacher leaders in buildings comfortable with exactly how to use technology to personalize learning, to increase student engagement. And that we're now in cohort 2 of that fellowship, which is a competitive fellowship for teacher leaders across DC. And we all spent Monday with them all day, and I think to a person, they said, this is the best professional development that we've ever had. And then it made me step back and say, are we taking seriously enough across all school models the time and the investment in human capital that it really takes to have people not just use technology, but actually own it themselves and be able to be ambassadors within their schools?
Yeah, Lisa.
Yeah, if I could just piggyback on that. I'm Lisa Guernsey. I direct the Early Ed Initiative at New America, but I'm also starting a new project that's birthed through Workforce called Learning Technologies Project. And one of the things that I was going to ask Jim about, but it I think is very connected, is are we at a place where we need to start defining professional development more deeply so that we are making a distinction between tutorial on a product and deep, intensive professional development around rethinking teaching and what it means in the classroom and in informal learning environments for kids. And if we are at that place, does that mean that the change has to come from our institutions of higher ed, teacher prep, new models of professional development?
So I fight very hard to stay away from like the naming games because I'm never really good at them. But here's my take. My take is that we have all fallen prey to not acknowledging the full scope of what competencies actually look like. And competency around the specific technology that you use in your classroom every day is actually something that you need to perform well, as well as the metacognition and the other problem-solving skills that you need to understand how you actually approach a pedagogical problem well as a teacher. Both of those are really important parts of the professional development someone needs to be effective as a teacher in a classroom. We need to be attentive to all of those things. What we need to do, though, is not confuse them. And that is a lot of what has happened, is that, again, because of what we said earlier, where the technology has led, a lot of times what has happened in the past in particular is someone has come to explain how their product works, and that has been almost the only development they get about the application of that technology to improve their instructional practice. And that is where we fall down. And I will push hard on our schools, our preparatory institution. They basically have ignored it. Like, there's a few places where you can find a course or a class on curriculum integration, especially from back in the old days. Some of the technology providers even provided some resources to fund that stuff. But for the most part, our schools, you've not seen our schools of education pressing this issue, right? And so I gave there's this thing called the Global Learning Council last week at Carnegie Mellon, and I'm about to go on a tangent for a second. I apologize, but one of the things that I've talked about, everyone in this who should know about Bloom's 2 sigma problem, and if you don't know the Bloom's 2 sigma problem, you should. It basically is this very simple thing that says that for a one-to-one tutor outperforms a classroom instruction by 2 standard deviations, which means that you can take, with a one-to-one tutor, the average one-to-one tutor, a 50th percentile student to the 98th percentile. Now, why don't we do that? Because we can't afford it. Fine. So how do we afford it? And we've known this for a really long time. The question then is, how do we create the systems and the structures and tools and resources and the capabilities within our teachers to close the gap that we know can be closed for the students? We allow students to be put under a curve that is not reflective of their capability because we haven't figured out how to solve that very straightforward problem. So the reason I go there is because the question is now, how do we put together the combination of tools and resources and new capabilities that schools of education should be driving, along with, because most cases they sit on campuses with lots of other people, to pursue that question relentlessly. Like, if we know we can do it, what is our excuse for not doing it? Like,
Well, Mark, you know.
Can I, before we go to Mark's separate topic, if I could just add to that. We've trained over 10 million teachers around the world on how to use technology within their classrooms. As a matter of fact, that professional development isn't about our solutions at all. It really is filling what we perceived as a gap in simply how to make teachers comfortable bringing technology in. And I will be the first to say what we're doing isn't sufficient. That it is enough to make them comfortable bringing the technology in, but what we now recognize is there's an ongoing development requirement, which is how do they communicate with other teachers, to your earlier point, and share digital lesson plans. And if you are the only science teacher within your school, your county, you can connect with other science teachers and you can benefit from the digital lesson plans they've already created or the digital content that they've found on their own that is outside of their standard curriculum. And I think there's an opportunity for us to be able to partner very differently. I mean, we work closely with Microsoft today on the professional development that we're essentially taking to market and what they're doing so that we complement each other and we're not duplicating each other's work. But there's a big opportunity for us to be able to work with other essentially companies or providers of professional development to ensure that it really is
schools?
Of course.
Yeah.
And that's an area that we haven't really focused on.
Correct. Yeah. Right. Mark? Yeah.
So yeah, this kind of takes to a more general level, but you spent a lot of time recently studying and writing about how innovation happens.
Yep, me.
Yeah, you, Walter. This is a shout out for you. You've got a new book all about this, and you discuss.
He's read it.
You know where collaboration or where innovation comes from, individuals' collaborations. This is, you spent a lot of time in education as well. I'd love to get your take after looking at innovation and how it happens. In this area, there's a lot of stakeholders. We've talked a lot about different stakeholders. in your view, who do you think of the stakeholders are going to lead this charge? Students, teachers, product
Right, and it
innovators?
gets back a little to Steve's question, not that I have somebody bring it to scale, but I did, I like Sal Khan's book, The One-Room Schoolhouse, and that's both personalized, to get to your point, education, but also collaborative, meaning, I actually went there yesterday out, in Mountain View. It is one big room with about 45 kids, age 5 to 12. They are paired up collaboratively to teach each other, as well as to each move at their own pace instead of being put in different grades. Now, that's innovative. One thing about innovation is 90% of innovation ends up, to use the technical term that Jim taught me today, sucking. And, it may not work. I do think that he's tried it enough that you're starting to see, here's what the technology allows. It allows each kid to, as you say, drill down really hard if they care about something. But learning in the digital innovative economy also means learning teamwork and collaboration. That creativity nowadays is a collaborative sport. It isn't something people do in a garret or a garage and they come out with a light bulb or something. So that is something that you have to, I think, integrate into this process of both personalized learning, teachers that can do one-on-one instructions when they need to, but also saying, okay, but you're going to work as a class or as a group, as a team, helping each other learn, not just because that makes for better learning in the classroom, but it makes for a better skill set when you leave the classroom. But I just open it up that way. I'm sorry, lots of hands. I saw, okay, Andrew, yeah, and then we'll go here, and Molly, and then Joshua if we get time. Yes. Yeah.
My name is Andrew Backel. I'm with the Center for Excellence in Education, McLean. My background, though, is actually closer to Marx and entertainment in Hollywood and running a tech company in Silicon Valley for a few years, so interacting with Apple and Intel and others. And I want to pick up on a point that Alan made about fear or about change, resistance to change, which I feel has to do with fear of doing new things. So the fear of adoption. In other words, how do you get people, you can create all this wonderful stuff, all these devices, but how do you get people to use it? And I don't think the problem is the students. I think the problem is the districts and the teachers. And I think there's some correlation with demographics and age, right? So if you have this idea of how do you, even if you've got the devices and whether the kids can afford them, depending on where they are, and you get them into their hands, how do you get districts and teachers to get over their fear of using it? Right?
Jim? Yeah.
And connecting that with the idea of the power of big data. Maybe districts and teachers and an older set can be convinced to use technology because of the power of what you can track. And my fear is that campaign won't come from the private sector because there aren't enough intels of the world with an enlightened view of trying to make this adoption happen across the country. That really comes back to DOE, doesn't it? In terms of how do we get.
Well, we'll let Jim take it on.
Yeah. So I think if it comes from us, we're doomed. No, but I mean, in all seriousness, what I think is that we talked about this before. In all the groups I talked about in terms of barriers to change, students was not one of them. Right? So the truth of the matter is, and this is especially we're having a very K-12 focused conversation, but especially outside of K-12, where people are just trying to change their lives. They are going to chase whatever is going to give them that opportunity. So let's take that off the table for a second. Come back to K-12 and talk about teachers and educators in general. My take is that in general, the value proposition, as I kind of started off with, has not been really clear. Like, what is it that this technology is going to do? How is it going to increase the probability that I'm actually going to be either better at my job or I'm going to be the same at my job and it's going to be easier than it was before? Like, those two fundamental questions. Is it going to give me more time? Is it going to help my students do better? If you can't answer those questions, whether big data or otherwise, then people in general aren't going to want to do it. And so far, we've not been able to make a really compelling case. We are asserting it, We're asserting it. This technology has helped every other sector. It's going to help you too. And then they get it, not so much. So the reality is that what we're starting to see now is we're getting to a critical mass of places that are actually demonstrating that through the use of these new tools and resources, they are seeing differences in outcomes. They are seeing differences in practice. And one of the things I haven't talked about yet that I am both super optimistic about and super worried that we're going to miss the window of opportunity is, adult learning is different. And one of the things about adults is they're really focused on, like, what am I going to use this for? We think kids are focused on it. Adults have no patience for learning anything new if they don't think they have a use for it. And so the question is,
I didn't know that.
well, there is this small percentage.
Okay. We feed on at the Aspen Institute, but go ahead. People in this room. Yeah, right, that's how that, yeah.
So the question becomes, how do you create utility right away? Well, change. And the entire educational environment is changing right away. Every educator who is in a classroom now is having to think about their practice and whether it's going to actually allow them to be effective with the new context that they find themselves with their new college and career-ready standards, with the very different kinds of questions that are being asked of their students and their students are being asked to answer, with the expectation that their students are going to be able to produce real end products that can be looked at by folks on the outside. All of those things are changing both the very expectations and even the confidence level that adults, the educators, have that they know how to do, even if they've been effective before, what they've been asked to do. When that moment happens, it is the perfect opportunity to insert new tools and resources to help people, if you can convince them that that new tool and resource is going to help them achieve the new expectation. So we have the perfect storm, if you will. It is a storm, because it's a lot of change at one time, to be able to provide people with new tools and resources at the same time as expectations are changing in a way that is making them demand something to help me be successful, because they're desperately afraid they're not going to be.
I've got 4 people who have already raised their hand, and we're sort of over time, so I'm going to make it wrap around quickly if I could, but go ahead.
I'm Danny Edelson. I'm direct National Geographic's education reform efforts, and but for 15 years before that, I was in a school of education, and I want to stand up for an important group that hasn't been mentioned here, and it came to mind several times. I have a generalization about education, which is that we tend to reinvent it every few years because, on the one hand, we bring in a lot of new people who have new ideas and new energy, but on the other hand, we're not good at learning lessons from the past. And I would say that the Montessori is a tremendous example of that, of too few innovators in education today know anything about Montessori, whereas what they're doing is inventing it, just as the new math people reinvented using manipulatives that Maria Montessori had invented. But the group I want to speak up for are the people who have been doing research in these fields for decades, particularly with the support of the National Science Foundation. And I spent most of my career in that group. And when Lisa said earlier that they're starting to make a distinction between training and deep professional development, particularly around technology, I could name a dozen people at universities like the University of Michigan and Washington and Stanford and Harvard and my institution, Northwestern, who have been looking at that in quite some depth for a considerable period of time. And when I'm in groups like this, I'm always struck by the disconnect between the researchers who admittedly don't do a good job of communicating out to groups like this, and to groups like this who may not have even thought to look to that group. And it's also an underfunded and under-resourced group, but in particular, people who have been cultivated by the National Science Foundation, to a certain extent by ARPA and DARPA, a certain extent more recently by the Department of Education. There are a lot of resources and there is a lot of expertise out there that we can reduce inefficiency, we can prevent ourselves from having to relearn lessons if we spend a little bit more time looking for existing expertise.
That's a
in that.
good point. Molly?
So I wanted to press Jim a little bit on teacher preparation. And at the highest conceptual level, I think we could all agree that great teacher preparation programs yield great teachers, and great teachers yield great learning on the part of students. But in between that, there are a lot of factors that alter how things work. It could be socioeconomic conditions, it could be health, it could be what's going on in the classroom, in the school. So how do you connect the dots between teacher preparation, where after all, the content of what they're going to teach doesn't come from the School of Education. It comes from some other part of the university. How do you get there from here?
Do you want to take all of them, or?
Well, actually, that's a
Okay.
good point, and Molly, it's a good question.
So, the correlations between lack of opportunity broadly and poor quality education tell us that we have to figure out how these things come together if we want to get where we're trying to go. There's been a great body of work that is starting to evolve where we've talked about it in lots of different ways, but the science is becoming more and more clear about how these things play out together and frankly what we can do about it. The president, so I'll start with the secretary was the only person, you guys remember there was this, I can't even remember the names of the groups anymore. There was the Bold and Reform group, and then there was the We Like Supporting Kids group, and he signed both, right? Because he recognized that we both have to provide the kind of supports to allow kids to come to school ready to learn and to leave school supported, as well as high quality instruction inside. Schools of education need to actually help teachers understand that better and how they work together. They also need to be not just about teacher preparation, but these questions that we're asking about school design and how you actually integrate these supports and services so you can actually support kids in poverty, which schools of education are not notoriously good at helping them to do. And then we have to design our systems to actually accommodate the fact that teachers will never be the ones to solve all those problems on their own. Both the school needs to be designed that way and the system needs to be designed that way. When I say system, I'm not talking about the district. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it is that there are those things that we need to be teaching teachers that we're not, about the impacts of poverty, about the impact of chronic stress, about how you actually deal with kids that have extraordinary behavioral issues because of it, and how you maintain the rest of your classroom when you do that. Most schools of education don't do that either. So there's a whole conversation to be had about the role of poverty and inequity in mitigating educational improvement. But there's also a whole world of science to be brought to bear on how we actually prepare teachers to deal with the issues that are part of our reality. And I think technology can be a part of that as well. Because the first thing I remember I said is about access. And access can start before kids get there, after school kids get there, and again, to the point about the data, can give us insights in the kinds of supports that are needed in a very different way than we've ever had before.
Joshua?
I just want to underscore this point about collaboration, which is really interesting, and what's underneath collaboration, which is intimate relationships. We're living at the tail end of hundreds of years with this Enlightenment model of the individual as the core unit of experience, and my experience in education was that was at the center where, it's all about what's inside our brain, and then it's tested in this solitary way. And the technology piece is fascinating to me because, on the one hand, if you look at the social science of connectivity, actually, a lot of it really began to take off when the internet took off because it provided a metaphor. Before that, this idea of social neuroscience was laughed at. But once the internet was prevalent, people had a metaphor to understand that we could simultaneously be individual nodes and also interconnected. And there's obviously enormous collaborative possibilities. If you think about what you can do with Google Docs, two people doing the same document at the same time. At the same time, it seems like the technology is extremely dangerous because it's, in so many lives, a kind of tool for alienation and distancing from that one-on-one human connection, which is what I pick up on when you talk about the power of a tutor in a room. To some extent, it's impersonal, it's resources, it's time, it's energy, and so forth. But a lot of it is being able to have that one-on-one experience that, you know, I think if we look back on our educational lives, those are the things that really make us flower.
Patrick.
I spent 40 years in helping companies use technology and change and innovate. And it strikes me one thing's really missing from this conversation, and that's the role of the leader who actually organizes and drives the change. And to me, in a school, that's the principal. And I haven't heard the word principal talked about.
We have our principal of the year.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the principal, and actually, that's a good example. I mean, but we haven't been talking about the role of the principal in actually driving the change. I think Alan's really right. I mean, you're right, the evidence that this stuff works is overwhelming. It's got to be communicated to teachers, but somebody has got to drive it at the institutional level at the right place. It can't be a superintendent of school. It's got to be somebody that's low enough with the people that are actually involved. And
We're
that's
starting to focus more too on training school leaders, which hasn't been enough focus. Let me let Laura get the last word in, and then we'll let Jim.
Oh, wow, that's pressure. Thank you for letting me take a moment. Ross usually invites me to these things because I will throw a coin in the meter of assessment, and we haven't talked a lot about it. Jim, you alluded to it earlier, but I think one of the legs of the stool of this effort has to be around rethinking assessment. We have new standards, which are the Common Core standards, which have been adopted by almost all, but not all states, but almost all. It gives us a common language, a common framework. We have new breakthrough technology. Every school, to some degree, is moving forward, some much more rapidly than others, and Sheila talked about that. But we have a new paradigm. And if we just measure, and we have to validate, and frankly, any good teacher will tell you that they need to know where their kids are at every moment and every day so they know what to do next. So assessment isn't a bad word, but if we continue to use the assessments of the past in a new paradigm, we will not be successful, and I think we will frustrate efforts. So the work that I do with PARC, the Partnership for the Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers, long name, not very sexy, is working with states to develop new technology-based, flexible assessments that I think are part of the solution. We mostly talk about assessments as part of the problem, whether it's over-testing or boring testing that isn't in sync with some of the really cool technology-based learning programs we're seeing. And I want us to think differently about that, and that's what PARC is doing. It's not the only solution, but it's a critical piece. And as we go back into the work that we're all doing in classrooms, I hope we're all thinking about how assessment can be part of the solution and not just part of the problem, so we can really make sure we have a coherent set of tools.
So, I mean, in the end, we know that we have to know how our students are doing, and that we want to measure their progress towards the things that are going to let them have the opportunities that we talked about. And what we tried to do with the RFPs that led to the two consortia, one of which is PARC, creating these new assessments, was to lean into what the future of assessment should look like. And both consortia are doing great work. And by the way, I say things like great and good. I neither endorse your book or endorse but the reality is that they could only meet a portion of what we actually requested in the RFP because the research wasn't there, the technology wasn't there. We weren't ready as a nation to do even what we know enough today to aspire to. And so this is a reason that Laura's exactly right, that the assessment piece, this has to be essential. It has to be at the center of the work. So we know that as we do this innovative work, as we do try new things, that we are not, this is a place where we can't afford to let the eggs hit the ground, right? They have to be balls, you can drop it, but you have to catch it and be able to get it back on track. The only way you can do that is through assessment. The only way we can get the kind of assessments that we want is a new layer of R&D that allows us to get away from the stupid conversations that we have about assessment, be another technical term, and get more into the, like, how do you make it melt into the background? How do you make it so that we're not having conversations with parents about how many days of testing there has to be? And these are things that are well within our capability set.
The technology will help us.
And we just need to get it done.
Let me have you end, if I may, on bigger, I mean, a larger, more elevated note, sort of along the lines you were answering Molly Broad's question about, which is with your other hat, besides being the deputy secretary, you help coordinate My Brother's Keeper, which should be the signature economic, political, and moral issue, both of our country and also of this administration. How does that tie in with what we've been talking about today?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because oftentimes people see these conversations as divergent, right? There's this equity conversation over here, and those poor boys of color and their low performance on these outcomes, and there's this really cool, innovative conversation over here, and that couldn't be more wrong. Like, the biggest and best opportunity for impact of technology and frankly innovation will come from us using it to close the gaps in performance that we see today, and frankly to leapfrog the gains of performance that we thought were exceptional previously. I talked about those layers. Being able to provide access to kids who don't even have access today. So one of the things that came out in the My Brother's Keeper report is that, you know, as hard as it is to get kids to be AP ready, of the black and brown boys that are AP ready, only 3 out of 10 of them will actually take AP courses. Now, some of that is because of guidance and stuff like that. For 70% of them, it's because they aren't offered in their schools. There's just no excuse for that, and technology can help with that. Innovation can help with that. We talked about the impact of personalized learning, being able to take people where they are and actually get them to where they need to be, not only more effectively, but more quickly, and with more continuous support from lots of different resources, from different sources over time. That is something specifically, whether you're talking about rural isolation, or you're talking about economic isolation, or you're talking about cultural isolation, where somebody, whether they're doing poorly or they're doing well, who doesn't want to raise their hand, you can actually close that gap for them. The collaboration, the community, and the creativity, all of those things, and very frankly, simple engagement, all of those things are things that we know that when applied well, technology enhances all of them. And so, you know, didn't talk about Worcester Tech. Worcester Tech used to be a rough school. But they started doing something meaningful. Kids started showing up. You don't get to 95% without kids showing up in school. You don't get to 95% graduation rates without kids having meaning from school. And you definitely don't get to 95% graduation rates with college credit for 80% of them without them actually applying themselves and doing great work, using the new tools that are available to them. One time, why not many times? Technology can help with that. Innovation can help with that. But ultimately, context and will is what's going to make this thing happen.
Here, here.
Jim Shelton, you always show me why you're one of my inspirations. Thank you, sir.